The Expedition of Humphry Clinker. By Tobias Smollett. To Mrs. Mary Jones, at Brambleton Hall. Dear Molly, we are all upon the wing, hey for London, girl! Fex. We have been long enough here, for we're all turned tipsy-turvy. Mistress has excarded Sir Alec for kicking of Chowder, and I have sent Frizzle away, with a flea in his ear. I've shown him how little I minded his tinsy and his long tail, a feller, who would think for to go, for to offer, to take, up with a dirty trollop under my nose. I catched him in the very feet, coming out of the housemaid's garret. But I have Gian the dirty slut a size rary. Oh Molly! The servants at Bath are devils in garnet. They light the candle at both ends. Here's nothing but kinketting, and wasting, and thieving and tricking, and trigging, and then they are never content. They won't suffer the squire and mistress to stay any longer, because they have been already above 3 weeks in the house, and they look for a couple of guineas apiece at our going away, and this is a perquisite they expect every month in the season, being as how no family has a right to stay longer than 4 weeks in the same lodgings, and so the cook swears she will pin the dishclout to mistress's tail, and the housemaid vows she'll put couch in master's bed, if so be he don't descamp. Without further ado, I don't blame them for making the most of their market, in the way of veils and perquisites, and I defy the devil to say I am a tale carrier, or ever brought a poor servant into trouble, but then they ought to have some conscience, in wronging those that be servants like themselves, for you must know, Molly, I missed 3/4 of blonde lace, and a remnant of muslin, and my silver thimble, which was the gift of true love. They were all in my work basket, that I left upon the table in the servants' hall, when mistress's bell rung, but if they had been under lock and key, told have been all the same, for there are double keys to all the locks in Bath, and they say as how the very teeth ain't safe in your head, if you sleep with your mouth open, and so says I to myself, them things could not go without hands, and so I'll watch their waters, and so I did with a witness, for then it was I found bed consarned with Frizzle. And as the cook had thrown her slush at me, because I had taken part with Chowder, when he fit, with the turnspit, I resolved to make a clear kitchen, and throw some of her fat into the fire. I catched the chairwoman going out with her load in the morning, before she thought I was up, and brought her to mistress with her whole cargo. Mary, what dost think she had got in the name of God? Her buckets were foaming full of our best bear, and her lap was stuffed with a cold tongue, part of a buttock of beef, half a turkey, and a swinging lump of butter, and the matter of 10 mould candles, that had scarce ever been lit. The cook brazened it out, and said it was her right to rummage the pantry, and she was ready for to go before the mayor, that he had been her potticary many years, and would never think of hurting a poor servant, for giving away the scraps of the kitchen. I went another way to work with Madam Betty, because she had been saucy, and called me scandalous names, and said Frizzle couldn't abide me, and 20 other odorous falsehoods. I got a warrant from the mayor, and her box being searched by the constable, my things came out sure enough, besides a full pound of wax candles, and a nightcap of mistress, that I could swear to on my crouper loaf. Then Madam Mopstick came upon her merry bones, and as the squire wouldn't hear of a persecution, she scaped a skewering, but the longest day she has to live, she'll remember your humble servant, W. Jenkins. Bath, May 15th. If the hind should come again, before we be gone, pray send me the shift and apron, with the white gallow manky shoes, which you'll find in my pillowber, sarvice to Sir Watkin Phillips, Bart. Of Jesus College, Uxon. You are in the right, dear Phillips. I don't expect regular answers to every letter. I know a college life is too circumscribed to afford materials for such quick returns of communication. For my part, I am continually shifting the scene, and surrounded with new objects, some of which are striking enough. I shall therefore conclude my journal, for your amusement, and, though, in all appearance, it will not treat of very important or interesting particulars, it may prove, perhaps, not altogether uninstructive and unentertaining, The music and entertainments of Bath are over for this season, and all our gay birds of passage have taken their flight to Bristol, Tunbridge, Brighthelmstone, Scarborough, Harrogate, and C. Not a soul is seen, in this place, but a few broken-winded parsons, waddling like so many crows along the North Parade. There is always a great show of the clergy at Bath, none of your thin, puny, yellow, hectic figures, exhausted with abstinence, and hardy study, laboring under the morbi eruditorium, but great overgrown dignitaries and rectors, with rubicund noses and gouty ankles, or broad bloated faces, dragging, along great swag bellies, the emblems of sloth and indigestion. Now we are upon the subject of parsons, I must tell you a ludicrous adventure, which was achieved the other day by Tom Eastgate, whom you may remember on the foundation of Queen's. He had been very assiduous to pin himself upon George Prankley, who was a gentleman commoner of Christchurch, knowing the said Prankley was heir to a considerable estate, and would have the advowson of a good living, the incumbent of which was very old and infirm. He studied his passions, and flattered them so effectually, as to become his companion and counsellor, and, at last, obtained of him a promise of the presentation, when the living should fall. Prankley, on his uncle's death, quitted Oxford, and made his first appearance in the fashionable world at London, from whence he came lately to Bath, where he has been exhibiting himself among the bucks and gamesters of the place. Eastgate followed him hither, but he should not have quitted him for a moment, at his first emerging into life. He ought to have known he was a fantastic, foolish, fickle fellow, who would forget his collegiate attachments the moment they ceased appealing to his senses. Tom met with a cold reception from his old friend, and was, moreover, informed that he had promised the living to another man, who had a vote in the county, where he proposed to offer himself a candidate at the next general election. He now remembered nothing of Eastgate, but the freedoms he had used to take with him, while Tom had quietly stood his butt, with a knight to the benefice, and those freedoms he began to repeat in commonplace sarcasms on his person and his cloth, which he uttered in the public coffee-house, for the entertainment of the company. But he was egregiously mistaken in giving his own wit credit for that tameness of Eastgate, which had been entirely owing to prudential considerations. These being now removed, he retorted his repartee with interest, and found no great difficulty in turning the laugh upon the aggressor, who, losing his temper, called him names, and asked if he knew whom he talked to. After much altercation, Prankley, shaking his cane, bid him hold his tongue, otherwise he could dust his cassock for him. "I have no pretensions to such a valet," said Tom, "but if you should do me that office, and overheat yourself, I have here a good oaken towel at your service." Prankley was equally incensed and confounded at this reply. After a moment's pause, he took him aside towards the window, and, pointing to the clump of firs, on Clerkendown, asked in a whisper, if he had spirit enough to meet him there, with a case of pistols, at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. Eastgate answered in the affirmative, and, with a steady countenance, assured him he would not fail to give him the rendezvous at the hour he mentioned. So saying, he retired, and the challenger stayed some time in manifest agitation. In the morning, Eastgate, who knew his man, and had taken his resolution, went to Prankley's lodgings, and roused him by 5 o'clock. The squire, in all probability, cursed his punctuality in his heart, but he affected to talk big, and having prepared his artillery overnight, they crossed the water at the end of the South Parade. In their progress up the hill, Prankley often eyed the parson, in hopes of perceiving some reluctance in his countenance, but as no such marks appeared, he attempted to intimidate him by word of mouth. "If these flints do their office," said he, "I'll do thy business in a few minutes." "I desire you will do your best," replied the other. "For my part, I come not here to trifle. Our lives are in the hands of God, and one of us already totters on the brink of eternity." This remark seemed to make some impression upon the squire, who changed countenance, and with a faltering accent observed, that it ill became a clergyman to be concerned in quarrels and bloodshed, "Your insolence to me," said Eastgate, "I should have bore with patience, had not you cast the most infamous reflections upon my order, the honor of which I think myself in duty bound to maintain, even at the expense of my heart's blood, and surely it can be no crime to put out of the world a profligate wretch, without any sense of principle, morality, or religion." "Thou mayst take away my life," cried Prankley, in great perturbation, "but don't go to murder my character." "What? Hast got no conscience?" "My conscience is perfectly quiet," replied the other, "and now, sir, we are upon the spot, take your ground as near as you please, prime your pistol, and the Lord, of his infinite mercy, have compassion upon your miserable soul." This ejaculation he pronounced in a loud solemn tone, with his hat off, and his eyes lifted up. Then, drawing a large horse pistol, he presented, and put himself in a posture of action. Prankley took his distance, and endeavored to prime, but his hand shook with such violence, that he found this operation impracticable. His antagonist, seeing how it was with him, offered his assistance, and advanced for that purpose, when the poor squire, exceedingly alarmed at what he had heard and seen, desired the action might be deferred till next day, as he had not settled his affairs. "I haven't made my will," said he, "my sisters are not provided for, and I just now recollect an old promise, which my conscience tells me I ought to perform. I'll first convince thee, that I'm not a wretch without principle, and then thou shalt have an opportunity to take my life, which thou seemst to thirst after so eagerly." Eastgate understood the hint, and told him, that one day should break no squares, adding, "God forbid that I should be the means of hindering you from acting the part of an honest man, and a dutiful brother." By virtue of this cessation, they returned peaceably together. Prankley forthwith made out the presentation of the living, and delivered it to Eastgate, telling him at the same time, he had now settled his affairs, and was ready to attend him to the fir grove. But Tom declared he could not think of lifting his hand against the life of so great a benefactor. He did more. When they next met at the coffee-house, he asked pardon of Mr. Prankley, if in his passion he had said anything to give him offence, and the squire was so gracious as to forgive him with a cordial shake of the hand, declaring, that he did not like to be at variance with an old college companion. Next day, however, he left Bath abruptly. And then Eastgate told me all these particulars, not a little pleased with the effects of his own sagacity, by which he has secured a living worth 160 litres per annum. Of my uncle, I have nothing at present to say, but that we set out tomorrow for London en famille. He and the ladies, with the maid and chowder in a coach, I and the manservant a horseback. The particulars of our journey you shall have in my next, provided no accident happens to prevent. Yours ever, J. Melford, Bath. To Dr. Lewis. Dear Dick, I shall tomorrow set out for London, where I have bespoke lodgings, at Mrs. Norton's in Golden Square. Although I am no admirer of Bath, I shall leave it with regret, because I must part with some old friends, whom, in all probability, I shall never see again. In the course of coffee-house conversation, I had often heard very extraordinary encomiums passed on the performances of Mr. T, a gentleman residing in this place, who paints landscapes for his amusement. As I have no great confidence in the taste and judgment of coffee-house connoisseurs, and never received much pleasure from this branch of the art, those general praises made no impression at all on my curiosity, but, at the request of a particular friend, I went yesterday to see the pieces, which had been so warmly commended. I must own I am no judge of painting, though very fond of pictures. I don't imagine that my senses would play me so false, as to betray me into admiration of anything that was very bad, but, true it is, I have often overlooked capital beauties, in pieces of extraordinary merit. If I am not totally devoid of taste, however, this young gentleman of Bath is the best landscape painter now living. I was struck with his performances in such a manner, as I had never been by painting before. His trees not only have a richness of foliage and warmth of coloring, which delights the view, but also a certain magnificence in the disposition and spirit in the expression, which I cannot describe. His management of the chiaro oscuro, or light and shadow, especially gleams, of sunshine, is altogether wonderful, both in the contrivance and execution, and he is so happy in his perspective, and marking his distances at sea, by a progressive series of ships, vessels, capes, and promontories, that I could not help thinking I had a distant view of 30 leagues upon the background of the picture. If there is any taste for ingenuity left in a degenerate age, fast sinking into barbarism, this artist, I apprehend, will make a capital figure, as soon as his works are known. 2 days ago, I was favored with a visit by Mr. Fitzallen, who, with great formality, solicited my vote and interest at the general election. I ought not to have been shocked at the confidence of this man, though it was remarkable, considering what had passed between him and me on a former occasion. These visits are mere matter of form, which a candidate makes to every elector, even to those who, he knows, are engaged in the interest of his competitor, lest he should expose himself to the imputation of pride, at a time when it is expected he should appear humble. Indeed, I know nothing so abject as the behavior of a man canvassing for a seat in Parliament. This mean prostration, to borough electors, especially, has, I imagine, contributed in a great measure to raise that spirit of insolence among the vulgar, which, like the devil, will be found very difficult to lay. Be that as it may, I was in some confusion at the effrontery of Fitzallen, but I soon recollected myself, and told him, I had not yet determined for whom I should give my vote, nor whether I should give it for any. The truth is, I look upon both candidates in the same light, and should think myself a traitor to the constitution of my country, if I voted for either. If every elector would bring the same consideration home to his conscience, we should not have such reason to exclaim against the venality of P.T.S. But we all are a pack of venal and corrupted rascals, so lost to all sense of honesty, and all tenderness of character, that, in a little time, I am fully persuaded, nothing will be infamous but virtue and public spirit. G.H., who is really an enthusiast in patriotism, and represented the capital in several successive parliaments, declared to me t'other day, with the tears in his eyes, that he had lived above 30 years in the city of London, and dealt in the way of commerce with all the citizens of note in their turns, but that, as he should answer to God, he had never, in the whole course of his life, found above 3 or 4 whom he could call thoroughly honest, a declaration which was rather mortifying than surprising to me, who have found so few men of worth in the course of my acquaintance, that they serve only as exceptions, which, in the grammarian's phrase, confirm and prove a general canon. I know you will say, G.H. saw imperfectly through the mist of prejudice, and I am rankled by the spleen. Perhaps, you are partly in the right, for I have perceived that my opinion of mankind, like mercury in the thermometer, rises and falls according to the variations of the weather. Pray settle accompts with Barnes, take what money of mine is in his hands, and give him a quittance. If you think Davis has stock or credit enough to do justice to the farm, give him a discharge for the rent that is due. This will animate his industry, for I know that nothing is so discouraging to a farmer as the thoughts of being in arrears with his landlord. He becomes dispirited, and neglects his labor, and so the farm goes to wreck. Tabby has been clamoring for some days about the lamb's skin, which Williams, the hind, begged of me, when he was last at Bath. Prithee take it back, paying the fellow the full value of it, that I may have some peace in my own house, and let him keep his own counsel, if he means to keep his place. Oh! I shall never presume to despise or censure any poor man, for suffering himself to be henpecked, conscious how I myself am obliged to truckle to a domestic demon, even though, blessed be God, she is not yoked with me for life. In the matrimonial wagon, she has quarrelled with the servants of the house about veils, and such intolerable scolding ensued on both sides, that I have been fain to appease the cook and chambermaid by stealth. Can't you find some poor gentleman of Wales, to take this precious commodity off the hands of yours, Matt, Bramble Bath, maid. To Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis, give me leave to tell you, methinks you mought employ your talents better, than to encourage servants to pillage their masters. I find by Gwylym, that Williams has got my skin, for which he is an impotent rascal. He has not only got my skin, but, moreover, my buttermilk to fatten his pigs, and, I suppose, the next thing he gets, will be my pad to carry his daughter to church and fair. Roger gets this, and Roger gets that, but I'd have you to know, I won't be rogered at this rate by any ragmatical fellow in the kingdom, and I am surprised, Dr. Lewis, you would offer to put my affairs in composition with the refuge and skim of the hearth. I have toiled and moiled to a good purpose, for the advantage of Matt's family, if I can't save as much owl as will make me an under petticoat. As for the buttermilk, ne'er a pig in the parish shall thrust his snout in it, with my good will. There's a famous physician at the Hot Well, that prescribes it to his patients, when the case is consumptive, and the Scots and Irish have begun to drink it already, in such quantities, that there is not a drop left for the hogs in the whole neighbourhood of Bristol. I'll have our buttermilk barrelled up, and sent twice a week to Abergele, where it may be sold for a halfpenny the quart, and so Roger may carry his pigs to another market. I hope, Doctor, you will not go to put any more such fims in my brother's head, to the prejudice of my pocket, but rather give me some raisins, which hitherto you have not done, to subscribe myself your humble servant, Tab. Bramble Bath, May 19. To Sir Watkin Phillips, of Jesus College, Uxon. Dear Phillips, without waiting for your answer to my last, I proceed to give you an account of our journey to London, which has not been wholly barren of adventure. Tuesday last the squire took his place in a hired coach and four, accompanied by his sister and mine, and Mrs. Tabby's maid, Winifred Jenkins, whose province it was to support Chowder on a cushion in her lap. I could scarce refrain from laughing when I looked into the vehicle, and saw that animal sitting opposite to my uncle, like any other passenger. The squire, ashamed of his situation, blushed to the eyes, and, calling to the postilions to drive on, pulled the glass up in my face. I, and his servant, John Thomas, attended them on horseback. Nothing worth mentioning occurred, till we arrived on the edge of Marlborough Downs. There one of the four horses fell, in going downhill at a round trot, and the postilion behind, endeavouring to stop the carriage, pulled it on one side into a deep rut, where it was fairly overturned. I had rode on about 200 yards before, but, hearing a loud scream, galloped back and dismounted, to give what assistance was in my power. When I looked into the coach, I could see nothing distinctly, but the nether end of Jenkins, who was kicking her heels and squalling with great vociferation. All of a sudden, my uncle thrust up his bare pate, and bolted through the window, as nimble as a grasshopper, having made use of poor Win's posteriors as a step to rise in his ascent. The man, who had likewise quitted his horse, dragged this forlorn damsel, more dead than alive, through the same opening. Then Mr. Bramble, pulling the door off its hinges with a jerk, laid hold on Lydia's arm, and brought her to the light, very much frighted, but little hurt. It fell to my share to deliver our Aunt Tabitha, who had lost her cap in the struggle, and being rather more than half frantic, with rage and terror, was no bad representation of one of the sister furies that guard the gates of hell. She expressed no sort of concern for her brother, who ran about in the cold, without his periwig, and worked with the most astonishing agility, in helping to disentangle the horses from the carriage, but she cried, in a tone of distraction, "Chowder! Chowder! My dear Chowder! My poor Chowder is certainly killed." This was not the case. Chowder, after having tore my uncle's leg in the confusion of the fall, had retreated under the scat, and from thence the footman drew him by the neck, for which good office, he bit his fingers to the bone. The fellow, who is naturally surly, was so provoked at this assault, that he saluted his ribs with a hearty kick, exclaiming, "Damn the nasty son of a bitch, and them he belongs to." A benediction, which was by no means lost upon the implacable virago his mistress. Her brother, however, prevailed upon her to retire into a peasant's house, near the scene of action, where his head and hers were covered, and poor Jenkins had a fit. Our next care was to apply some sticking plaister to the wound in his leg, which exhibited the impression of Chowder's teeth, but he never opened his lips against the delinquent. Mrs. Tabby, alarmed at this scene, "You say nothing, Matt," cried she, "but I know your mind, I know the spite you have to that poor unfortunate animal. I know you intend to take his life away." "You are mistaken, upon my honor," replied the squire, with a sarcastic smile. "I should be incapable of harboring any such cruel design against an object so amiable and inoffensive, even if he had not the happiness to be your favorite." John Thomas was not so delicate. The fellow, whether really alarmed for his life, or instigated by the desire of revenge, came in, and bluntly demanded, that the dog should be put to death, on the supposition, that if ever he should run mad hereafter, he, who had been bit by him, would be infected. My uncle calmly argued upon the absurdity of his opinion, observing, that he himself was in the same predicament, and would certainly take the precaution he proposed, if he was not sure he ran no risk of infection. Nevertheless, Thomas continued obstinate, and, at length declared, that if the dog was not shot immediately, he himself would be his executioner. This declaration opened the floodgates of Tabby's eloquence, which would have shamed the first-rate oratress of Billingsgate. The footman retorted in the same style, and the squire dismissed him from his service, after having prevented me from giving him a good horsewhipping for his insolence. The coach being adjusted, another difficulty occurred. Mrs. Tabitha absolutely refused to enter it again, unless another driver could be found to take the place of the postilion, who, she affirmed, had overturned the carriage from malice aforethought. After much dispute, the man resigned his place to a shabby country fellow, who undertook to go as far as Marlborough, where they could be better provided, and at that place we arrived about 1 o'clock, without farther impediment. Mrs. Bramble, however, found new matter of offence, which, indeed, she has a particular genius for, extracting at will from almost every incident in life. We had scarce entered the room at Marlborough, where we stayed to dine, when she exhibited a formal complaint against the poor fellow who had superseded the postilion. She said he was such a beggarly rascal that he had ne'er a shirt to his back, and had the impudence to shock her sight by showing his bare posteriors, for which act of indelicacy he deserved to be set in the stocks. Mrs. Winifred Jenkins confirmed the assertion, with respect to his nakedness, observing, at the same time, that he had a skin as fair as alabaster. "This is a heinous offence, indeed," cried my uncle. "Let us hear what the fellow has to say in his own vindication." He was accordingly summoned, and made his appearance, which was equally queer and pathetic. He seemed to be about 20 years of age, of a middling size, with bandy legs, stooping shoulders, high forehead, sandy locks, pinking eyes, flat nose, and long chin, but his complexion was of a sickly yellow, his looks denoted famine, and the rags that he wore could hardly conceal what decency requires to be covered. My uncle, having surveyed him attentively, said, with an ironical expression in his countenance, "Aren't you ashamed, fellow, to ride postilion without a shirt to cover your backside from the view of the ladies in the coach?" "Yes, I am, an'please your noble honor," answered the man, "but necessity has no law, as the saying is, and more than that, it was an accident. My breeches cracked behind, after I had got into the saddle." "You're an impudent varlet," cried Mrs. Tabby, "for presuming to ride before persons of fashion without a shirt." "I am so, an'please your worthy ladyship," said he, "but I am a poor Wiltshire lad, I ha'n't a shirt in the world, that I can call my own, nor a rag of clothes, an'please your ladyship, but what you see, I have no friend nor relation upon earth to help me out. I have had the fever and ague these 6 months, and spent all I had in the world upon doctors, and to keep soul and body together, and, saving your ladyship's good presence, I ha'n't broke bread these 24 hours." Mrs. Bramble, turning from him, said, she had never seen such a filthy tatterdemalion, and bid him begone, observing, that he would fill the room full of vermin. Her brother darted a significant glance at her, as she retired with Liddy into another apartment, and then asked the man if he was known to any person in Marlborough. When he answered, that the landlord of the inn had known him from his infancy, mine host was immediately called, and being interrogated on the subject, declared that the young fellow's name was Humphry Clinker. That he had been a love-begotten babe, brought up in the workhouse, and put out apprentice by the parish to a country blacksmith, who died before the boy's time was out, that he had for some time worked under his ostler, as a helper and extra postilion, till he was taken ill of the ague, which disabled him from getting his bread, that, having sold or pawned everything he had in the world for his cure and subsistence, he became so miserable and shabby, that he disgraced the stable, and was dismissed, but that he never heard anything to the prejudice of his character in other respects. So that the fellow being sick and destitute, said my uncle, you turned him out to die in the streets. I pay the poor's rate, replied the other, and I have no right to maintain idle vagrants, either in sickness or health. Besides, such a miserable object would have brought a discredit upon my house. You perceive, said the squire, turning to me, our landlord is a Christian of bowels, who shall presume to censure the morals of the age, when the very publicans exhibit such examples of humanity? Hark ye, Clinker, you are a most notorious offender, you stand convicted of sickness, hunger, wretchedness, and want, but, as it does not belong to me to punish criminals, I will only take upon me the task of giving you a word of advice. Get a shirt with all convenient dispatch, that your nakedness may not henceforward give offense to travelling gentlewomen, especially maidens in years. So saying, he put a guinea into the hand of the poor fellow, who stood staring at him in silence, with his mouth wide open, till the landlord pushed him out of the room. In the afternoon, as our aunt stepped into the coach, she observed, with some marks of satisfaction, that the postilion, who rode next to her, was not a shabby wretch like the ragamuffin who had them into Marlborough. Indeed, the difference was very conspicuous. This was a smart fellow, with a narrow-brimmed hat, with gold cording, a cut bob, a decent blue jacket, leather breeches, and a clean linen shirt, puffed above the waistband. When we arrived at the castle, on Spin Hill, where we lay, this new postilion was remarkably assiduous in bringing in the loose parcels, and, at length, displayed the individual countenance of Humphry Clinker, who had metamorphosed himself in this manner, by relieving from pawn part of his own clothes, with the money he had received from Mr. Bramble. Howsoever pleased the rest of the company were, with such a favourable change in the appearance of this poor creature, it soured on the stomach of Mrs. Tabby, who had not yet digested the affront of his naked skin. She tossed her nose in disdain, saying, she supposed her brother had taken him into favour, because he had insulted her with his obscenity, that a fool and his money were soon parted, but that if Matt intended to take the fellow with him to London, she would not go a foot further that way. My uncle said nothing with his tongue, though his looks were sufficiently expressive, and next morning Clinker did not appear, so that we proceeded without further altercation to Salthill, where we proposed to dine. There, the first person that came to the side of the coach, and began to adjust the footboard, was no other than Humphry Clinker. When I handed out Mrs. Bramble, she eyed him with a furious look, and passed into the house. My uncle was embarrassed, and asked him peevishly, what had brought him hither. The fellow said, his honour had been so good to him, that he had not the heart to part with him, that he would follow him to the world's end, and serve him all the days of his life, without fee or reward. Mr. Bramble did not know whether to chide or laugh at this declaration. He foresaw much contradiction on the side of Tabby, and on the other hand, he could not but be pleased with the gratitude of Clinker, as well as with the simplicity of his character. Suppose I was inclined to take you into my service, said he, What are your qualifications? What are you good for? And please your honor, answered this original, I can read and write, and do the business of the stable indifferent well. I can dress a horse, and shoe him, and bleed and rowel him, and, as for the practice of so gelding, I won't turn my back on Arrohy in the county of Wilts. Then I can make hogs puddings and hobnails, mend kettles and tint saucepans. Here uncle burst out laughing, and inquired what other accomplishments he was master of. I know something of singlestick, and psalmody, proceeded Clinker. I can play upon the Jew's harp, sing Blackeyed Susan, Arthur O'Bradley, and divers other songs. I can dance a Welsh jig, and Nancy Dawson, wrestle a fall with any lad of my inches, when I'm in heart, and, under correction, I can find a hare when your honor wants a bit of game. For God! Thou're a complete fellow, cried my uncle, still laughing. I have a good mind to take thee into my family. Prithee, go and try if thou canst make peace with my sister. Thou hast given her much offence by showing her thy naked tail. Clinker accordingly followed us into the room, cap in hand, where, addressing himself to Mrs. Tabitha, "May it please your ladyship's worship," cried he, "to pardon and forgive my offences, and, with God's assistance, I shall take care that my tale shall never rise up in judgment against me, to offend your ladyship again. Do, pray, good, sweet, beautiful lady, take compassion on a poor sinner. God bless your noble countenance. I am sure you are too handsome and generous to bear malice. I will serve you on my bended knees, by night and by day, by land and by water, and all for the love and pleasure of serving such an excellent lady." This compliment and humiliation had some effect upon Tabby, but she made no reply, and Clinker, taking silence for consent, gave his attendance at dinner. The fellow's natural awkwardness and the flutter of his spirits were productive of repeated blunders in the course of his attendance. At length, he spilt part of a custard upon her right shoulder, and, starting back, trod upon Chowder, who set up a dismal howl. Poor Humphrey was so disconcerted at this double mistake, that he dropped the china dish, which broke into 1,000 pieces, then, falling down upon his knees, remained in that posture gaping, with a most ludicrous aspect of distress. Mrs. Bramble flew to the dog, and, snatching him in her arms, presented him to her brother, saying, "This is all a concerted scheme against this unfortunate animal, whose only crime is its regard for me. Here it is, kill it at once, and then you'll be satisfied." Clinker, hearing these words, and taking them in the literal acceptation, got up in some hurry, and seizing a knife from the sideboard, cried, "Not here, and please your ladyship, it will daub the room. Give him to me, and I'll carry him to the ditch by the roadside." To this proposal he received no other answer than a hearty box on the ear, that made him stagger to the other side of the room. "What?" said she to her brother, "am I to be affronted by every mangy hound that you pick up on the highway? I insist upon your sending this rascallion about his business immediately, for God's sake." "Sister, compose yourself," said my uncle, "and consider that the poor fellow is innocent of any intention to give you offence." "Innocent as the babe unborn," cried Humphrey. "I see it plainly," exclaimed this implacable maiden. "He acts by your direction, and you are resolved to support him in his impudence. This is a bad return for all the services I have done you, for nursing you in your sickness, managing your family, and keeping you from ruining yourself by your own imprudence. But now you shall part with that rascal or me, upon the spot, without farther loss of time, and the world shall see whether you have more regard for your own flesh and blood, or for a beggarly foundling taken from the dunghill." Mr. Bramble's eyes began to glisten, and his teeth to chatter. "If stated fairly," said he, raising his voice, "the question is, whether I have spirit to shake off an intolerable yoke, by one effort of resolution, or meanness enough to do an act of cruelty and injustice, to gratify the rancour of a capricious woman. Hark ye, Mrs. Tabitha Bramble, I will now propose an alternative in my turn. Either discard your four-footed favourite, or give me leave to bid you eternally adieu, for I am determined that he and I shall live no longer under the same roof, and to dinner with what appetite you may." Thunderstruck at this declaration, she sat down in a corner, and, after a pause of some minutes, "Sure I don't understand you, Matt," said she. "And yet I spoke in plain English," answered the squire, with a peremptory look. "Sir," resumed this virago, effectually humbled, "it is your prerogative to command, and my duty to obey. I can't dispose of the dog in this place, but if you'll allow him to go in the coach to London, I give you my word, he shall never trouble you again." Her brother, entirely disarmed by this mild reply, declared she could ask him nothing in reason that he would refuse, adding, "I hope, sister, you have never found me deficient in natural affection." Mrs. Tabitha immediately rose, and, throwing her arms about his neck, kissed him on the cheek. He returned her embrace with great emotion. Liddy sobbed, when Jenkins cackled, Chowder capered, and Clinker skipped about, rubbing his hands for joy of this reconciliation. Concord being thus restored, we finished our meal with comfort, and in the evening arrived at London, without having met with any other adventure. My aunt seems to be much mended, by the hint she received from her brother. She has been graciously pleased to remove her displeasure from Clinker, who is now retained as a footman, and in a day or two will make his appearance in a new suit of livery, but as he is little acquainted with London, we have taken an occasional valet, whom I intend hereafter to hire as my own servant. We lodge in Golden Square, at the house of one Mrs. Notion, a decent sort of a woman, who takes great pains to make us all easy. My uncle proposes to make a circuit of all the remarkable scenes of this metropolis, for the entertainment of his pupils, but as both you and I are already acquainted with most of those he will visit, and with some others he little dreams of, I shall only communicate what will be in some measure new to your observation. Remember me to our Jesuitical friends, and believe me ever, dear knight, yours affectionately, J.